Hey, and welcome to this video. My name is Marie, and today I would like to talk about the biopolitical border. As the term already suggests, it's about border and about biopolitics. Foucault did not really write about border, neither he wrote about migration, but nevertheless his idea about power are very fruitful to open a new and critical perspective on these phenomena and on border. Therefore, I would like to bring Foucault to the border today. In the context of the European Union border and migration politics, we have a lot of actors and actants that are involved in managing the shared EU external border. First to mention are the two EU agencies, EULISA and Frontex. EULISA is responsible for the interoperability of the large-scale IT systems. It is also managing Eurodac, the Schengen Information System and the Visa Information System. And then there's Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, responsible for the operation on the ground and on the Mediterranean Sea in cooperation with the national state actors. Apart from that, there's also Eurosur, the European Border Surveillance System. And then we have all the agreements, for example with third countries like Turkey and Libya, but also the readmission agreements. The European Union has 23 readmission agreements with different countries, for example with Nigeria and Bangladesh. Of course, we also have the national state competences and, for example, the national border polices. And all the equipment we also have to mention in this context, like vessels, ships, satellite pictures, radar, facial recognition, and also all the infrastructure that is related to managing the border, like detention centers, refugee camps, and fences and other physical barriers. The list is really long. And although there is massive criticism by NGOs about the missing humanitarian approach of the European Union and the member states by managing the external border, the majority of the population take the measurements and the border practices as necessary, as in the past decades there has been a securitization of the issue of migration, and migration has been constructed as harmful for the inside of the European Union. Today I would like to open a more critical perspective on the development of the European Union's border, and I will do this by applying Foucault's ideas on the concept of the border and talking about the biopolitical border. First, I will say something about border in general, what it is a border, where it is and why it exists. Secondly, I will refer to the two concepts of Foucault about biopolitics and biopower. And then, in the third step, I will apply the ideas of Foucault and present the biopolitical border in the context of the European Union. In the end, I will give some literature recommendation if you want to go deeper in the topic. If you have any questions, or if there's something you would like to know more about, then please leave me a comment and I can implement this in the next video. So first, to the concept of border in general. What is a border, where it is and why it exists? When we think about borders, we think, yes, that's super easy. It's the demarcation line of a territory or a political entity where one power ends and another sphere of power begins. We could imagine pictures like this or that. But when we reflect on this and when we take into account all the actors and all the measurements and all the tools that are used for border practices, then we see that it is not so easy anymore to grasp what it is a border. And these pictures, they don't catch all the dimensions of it. Also because the border practices are not just bound to geographical spaces, but they appear also outside and inside of the territory. Research on borders emerged around the late 19th century. Back then, the concept of the border was seen as an empirical phenomenon of the manifestation of sovereign state power and territory. The ideas about border were also bound mostly about the idea of expansion of territory and the legitimization of warlike measurements or war itself. In the Middle Ages, however, borders and sovereignties were not as clearly defined as they seem today. The spheres of power were much more blurred. It was with the idea of nation state that it arrived that there's a territory with a specific population and a state authority to govern. In this understanding, the border encompasses a specific territory with a homogeneous population and the state authority. That this is an idealized image can be seen especially in the border areas, but also within the territory by the representation of minorities, different cultures and languages. Today, a scientific research on borders is really diverse and interdisciplinary. Starting, of course, with geography, it expanded into political theory, international relations, sociology, art, philosophy, and other disciplines. Since the 1990s, there have been an opening of the perspective, and more critical views arrived that was mostly criticizing that borders has been seen as something objective and self-evident before in the past. Famous in this context is the quote of Etienne Balibar, who stated that borders are no longer at the borders. They are thinned out, doubled, and appearing deterritorialized. By this, he and also other scholars who express this criticism mean that the functions of the border are no longer bound to geographic spaces only, but they also appear outside and inside of the territory. Examples for this are the externalization of border control, also the visa application in embassies in other countries. And inside of the territory, there are controls at railway stations and at airports. As consequence, what is inside and what is outside is not clearly defined anymore, and also the responsibilities are much more blurred. At the same time, borders get securitized. I will make another video about securitization theory, but for now it's important, in short, that it means that there's no inherent danger to a subject or a situation or an object. It means that security gets constructed in discourse. In this process, political actors discuss and define what it is security, and they also decide on the measurements that have to be taken to face the threat. In the context of the European border, this leads to more surveillance and to a militarization of the border. In general, it gets more intensified, all the border practices. At the same time, migration gets more and more articulated in the context of criminality, human trafficking, and smuggle. The connection is made in the discourse, and this is happening increasingly since the 1980s. Through this process, the borders and border practices became more and more complex, but nevertheless, they implement a social sorting. So most of the measurements are concentrated to filter the unwanted travelers and make it easier to cross border for the trustworthy citizen traveler. Now that I have encouraged you to think about what is a border and to pay attention to their complexity, I will come to the second part where I will refer to the two concepts, the biopolitics and the biopower of Michel Foucault. Biopolitics is a term that mostly refers to the works of Michel Foucault. It is a research perspective that concerns the fact that in modernity, the main focus of politics has become the regulation and organization of life. In this sense, the population, but also the individual body, has become the target of politics. Very close to this concept is the concept of biopower that stands for an understanding of power that is not just prohibitive or restrictive, but is designed to enhance life and being productive. Furthermore, this type of power cannot be localized anymore. It is not as the former sovereign power, but it is underlying in the discourse and spreading into every part of society and also in the private life, even into the intimate sphere. Biopower therefore combines the population measurements like hygiene control, birth control, and statistics about population with the disciplination of the body through schools, military, and other institutions. Biopolitics and biopower therefore stand for an ambivalent way of exercising power that is controlling and surveilling, but also caring on the other hand. This also means that today politics are not just discussed in the main public arenas like in government or parliaments, but they also take space in the daily life, in the public sphere that is usually not meant for politics in a traditional sense. Biopower and biopolitics are not the way of power that kills like the former sovereign power. Although it was under a biopolitical condition that new really deadly ways for biological racism have emerged. Therefore, it is not like the former power to make die and let live. It is to make live and let die. This also means that it is not a just restrictive power, but it is there also shaping and producing the subject in society. Following this short overview, I will now present the biopolitical border that was first systematized and outlined by William Walters in a paper in 2002. Walters says that recently the border has become biopoliticized. It means that in its function, the border has become a privileged instrument for the regulation and restriction of population movements. It is about the filtered function of border controls. And now we might think, yeah, sure, borders are there to control migration. But this idea and this systematic approach to that is rather new, and it's quite surprising that we take militarization of border and this really intense border for granted. So let's take a look at the history of migration. Walters says that also in the past borders have been used to control migration. Nevertheless, it's quite recent that this approach is systematic and also institutionalized. Contrary to the view that borders are natural and always existed, we see that administrative barriers in the 19th century in Europe were quite minimal. And also in the United States, there has been no systematic approach, no regulation, no law until the 1880s. It was only after the First World War that border became biopoliticized. This went hand in hand with the discussion about national security and the Great Depression. And suddenly, visa, passport, ID, all these things were in high demand. This was accompanied by a politicization of migration, and with that there came also the construction of the foreigner. This was also accompanied by a racist component. In that time we see the development of different regulations that target a racialized population and restrict their mobility. Border controls therefore are both the reaction to, but also the condition for the development of the notion of refugee as an international crisis phenomenon. The biopoliticization of the border is not so much bound to a geographic space anymore. It appears deterritorialized and concerns more the techniques and the tools that are implemented. These include passports, visas, watchtowers, disembarkation stations, health certificates, invitation papers, laws, and a lot of other things. Within this process, the assemblage of security and measurements is not static but contingent and changing all the time. It depends what it attempts to govern. But what we can see through this is a social sorting that I also referred to before. It is a distinction between wanted and unwanted travelers, between desired and undesired migration, and also a decision about which life is worthy to live and which is to be neglected. Today we see a lot of biopolitical measurements in the context of the European Union border management. And these we should not take for granted. With this video I tried to open a more critical perspective on these aspects and the intensification of borders. All the border practices we can observe, all the tools and all the measurements, like increasing militarization, increasing technologization, the surveillance, the fences and the physical barriers that are increasingly implemented. We should problematize them. They are implemented in the name of security, but this notion of security really depends on the perspective. For example, for the migrants, they would see it as insecurity in process and not as a notion of security. If you're interested in the topic and you would like to read more about, I can recommend you the paper from William Walters from 2002, which is called Mapping Schengen, Denaturalizing the Border. Apart from that, I can also really recommend the book from Nick Vaughan-Williams, Border Politics, The Limits of Sovereign Power. In the book, he tries to open the approach and implement ideas from Agamben and from Walter Benjamin. And he's developing the notion of the generalized biopolitical border. Apart from that, I also really love the work from Louise Amour. She wrote a paper in the year 2006 about biometric borders governing the mobilities in the war on terror. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you enjoyed the video. All the links and all the footnotes you can find in the description. If you have any question, just write a comment. And if you like the video, you can also, of course, subscribe on my channel and be informed about the next video.